Today we're looking at bivariate data and scatterplots. Now, a scatterplot is just a chart that you can use to show two different variables and whether or not they have a relationship between them. So this is used for data points that come in pairs. Now, bi is two and variate just means variables. So we have two variables, but it's important to know that they're not just any two variables, they're pairs of data points. So perhaps you've measured, say, two different attributes about a person. The size of their hands and the size of their feet, and you want to see whether they're related. Do people with big hands also have big feet, or is it just a coincidence? Or perhaps you've measured two variables about a specific type of plant or an animal, and you want to see if one thing is related to the other. Well, you can put both variables onto the two axes of a scatter plot and then plot all of your points and see whether there seems to be a relationship. Now, if there is a relationship, we call it a correlation, and you'll see that that word relation is actually inside that word. So when you see the word correlation, it's just a relationship between the two things. So up here, I've got an example of a scatter plot. Now, we put the data points as little X's or little crosses, and a line of best fit can be drawn through the data, and that line is drawn in a way that it's equally distant from all of the data points. You sort of have to put it right through the middle. Now, it might not necessarily go through any of the data points, or it might. But here I've got a chart showing foot length and hand span. Now, I've just made up this data, but this is a classic sort of thing that could show you a really strong relationship, because it makes sense that people with a bigger foot are also probably going to have larger hands. So we can see here that these two things do in fact look like they have a relationship with each other, which makes sense. Now, there's two words or sets of words you can use to describe correlations. They can be positive or negative, and they can be strong or weak. So down here I have an example of all four combinations. Now, let's just examine what each of these means. If you have a positive correlation, that means that as one variable goes up, so does the other. That's what we've got up here. As your feet get bigger, your hands also seem to be bigger. Whereas a negative correlation states that as one variable is getting bigger or increasing, the other one is decreasing. So that would make our data points, as one of the things goes up, the other thing tends to go down. So that can happen as well. Now, strong and weak really just describes how far away the data points might be to that line of best fit that sort of cuts through the middle the best way that it can. Because if the dots are all really well lined up like this, and the line of best fit is really close to all of the data points, it means that it's a really strong correlation. You could almost predict that somebody who has a data point here is going to go with one that comes up here. There's very little leeway there. Whereas a weak correlation, we can see here that these data points, as this variable gets bigger, the other one tends to get bigger too. And you can see that because there's really no data points down here in this part of the graph or up here. But it's not quite as strong a relationship as this one. And we can tell because the data points are further away from that line of best fit. So similarly, this would be a strong negative correlation or a weak negative correlation. Now, one thing that's super important is to understand that a scatter plot can show you whether or not a relationship exists between two variables, but it cannot explain why that relationship exists. It does not mean that one thing causes another, it just means that they might be related to each other. Now, it could be that they're related to each other because they're both caused by something else, or it could be that there's actually just a complete coincidence causing what looks like a relationship.